Several months ago, I was stationed at my cashier job in the self-checkout area when I ran into a very peculiar customer. It happened as a slightly disheveled-looking man, appearing to be in his 60s, motioned me over to his register for assistance. He started by asking for help scanning his items, insisting he couldn't see the barcodes. Initially, I tried not to overthink it, figuring maybe his eyesight wasn't great or he had some other issue. He only had 2 items, a beverage and a candy bar. I helped him ring both, but it quickly became clear that he'd only requested my help as an excuse to get my undivided attention. He kept letting out this chuckle, but it wasn't a sweet or polite one. It sounded far more unstable. It dawned on me that he was likely under the influence of something, and in my head, I started mapping out a quick exit from our conversation. To make matters worse, he also kept asking for my number, and I just brushed it off awkwardly each time. I had to guide him through paying too because, surprise, he claimed he didn't know how to use the card machine, which made the encounter last even longer. When he finally paid and left, I assumed he was gone for good. Nope. Around 2 hours after that, it was time for my meal break. On my way to the break room, I ran into the man yet again. He gestured for me to come over. I politely told him, "Sir, I'm off the clock right now and heading for my lunch. Have a good evening." Then I picked up my pace, constantly checking over my shoulder until I entered the employees only section. My lunch break went fine, and for a bit the rest of my shift did too, until maybe a couple of hours later. Suddenly, I heard one of our security guards shouting, "Sir, I'm calling the police if you don't leave. You're bothering our customers and our workers. You cannot stay here." Sure enough, it was that same guy being yelled at. I watched him dart toward the rear of the store with security in pursuit. I couldn't abandon my post, so I just had to assume they caught up to him and got him out. Later, a coworker informed me that they'd been trying to kick that man out for hours, and at some point, he had also been pestering another female coworker of mine, who I'll label as Lacey. She didn't give the full story, so I assumed he'd used the same creepy tactics on Lacey that he used on me. Even though that was already unsettling, it got worse. A few days later, while I was on lunch break chatting with my friend Vera, I brought up the weirdo from Saturday night. She said she not only knew about him but had witnessed many of his disturbing actions. He had hit on Lacey, and when Lacey told him she was underage, he replied with, "That's okay. I like 13-year-old girls." Lacey had gotten so freaked out by this that she left early. I mentioned that he'd come on to me too, and Vera noted it was likely because I look much younger than my real age. I'm in my late 20s but can easily be mistaken for a teen. Vera also revealed that the man didn't actually leave the store until closing at midnight, and after that, he loitered in the lot for hours. I thought back to when I first encountered him on Saturday, and I worked out he must have been hanging around for at least 8 hours, doing next to nothing except creepily hitting on every young female he saw. To make matters scarier, I usually walk home, but one of my coworkers gave me a ride that particular night. If she hadn't, I almost certainly would have come across him in the parking lot, and I shudder to imagine what might have happened. Story 2. This event took place in August 2014, back when I was 16 and preparing to take my driver's exam. I had already gotten my permit months earlier and was taking behind-the-wheel lessons. Basically, there was a guy who sat in the passenger seat of a special car with a brake on that side, and he'd supervise and instruct me as I drove. I needed 3 sessions of 3 hours each with him before I'd be cleared for the driving test. The first session was mostly neighborhood and a bit of highway practice. The second revolved around city driving, and the last was a mixture of everything plus some parking drills. On the particular night in question, it was my third and final session. Unfortunately, I can't recall his name, but he was very chill and a good teacher. I remember our lesson began around 6 in the evening. We drove on several different roads, going over what I'd learned. I don't recall every minute detail, but as the sun started setting around 8, we ended up at a quiet park with a small parking lot. I wasn't even sure what city we were in, as I'd never been in that area. He asked me to park the vehicle, then got out to arrange a few cheap little orange cones as markers for a spot. After that, he returned to the passenger seat, and we started practicing. We were at one end of the lot, which was not huge but still gave us some space. The roads around it were mostly residential and very calm. As I continued working on my parking maneuvers, another car entered the lot from the far side and parked some distance away, so I paid it no mind. No one exited the vehicle and it just sat there. Then another vehicle entered a few minutes later, also parking a bit away from us. My instructor made a small comment like, wonder what they're doing here at this time. True, it was a bit unusual for people to come hang out in a park so late, but I tried focusing on the task at hand, my parking. I was doing all right, not hitting any cones. I'd been worried parallel parking would be my biggest obstacle on the test. But then the first car backed out of its space. The parking lot had 2 exits, one at each end, so initially I assumed it would just drive off. But as soon as I pulled into the makeshift space, the car drove behind us and halted just a few feet away. Unsure what was happening, I glanced at my instructor, who also looked puzzled. For about a full minute, the car remained there, not moving. We weren't blocking them. There was room for them to pass. My instructor told me to hang on, then opened his door and approached the vehicle to figure out the situation. I stared straight ahead, expecting him to return quickly. All of a sudden, my instructor came rushing back into our car, way faster than I'd anticipated. He looked alarmed and told me to leave the lot right away. I pointed out that we hadn't collected the cones, but he said, forget them. Clearly, he was rattled. I drove off, and that car trailed right behind us. My instructor explained, trying to keep me calm but clearly shaken, that one of the people in that car had a gun. He saw it when he went over to speak to them. Now the second car in the lot was tailing us too. I was absolutely terrified, particularly because I was the one driving. My instructor calmly directed me to head for the local police station, telling me to stay calm and not exceed the speed limit. It took maybe 5 to 10 minutes but felt so much longer. Both cars stayed on our tail the entire trip, never attempting to pass or anything. Finally, we pulled into the police station and they continued on. I parked and we went inside to file a report. That was the abrupt end of the lesson and my parents came to get me. I'm just grateful my instructor knew the best course of action. I did eventually pass my driving test on my first try, though that night definitely stuck with me. Story 3. If you're familiar with Blockbuster Video, you know it was a store for renting or buying DVDs and games before streaming services existed. In my childhood, our family often had Saturday movie nights. Sometimes we'd head to a theater. Other times we'd watch DVDs at home and occasionally we'd swing by Blockbuster to grab a rental. I always loved visiting Blockbuster. One Saturday my parents asked me and my sister if we wanted to rent a film. I was 12 and my sister was 14 at the time. We both agreed, but we couldn't settle on which title until finally we decided on something. This was likely around 2005. We lived in a nice area with plenty of houses and neighbors. About a mile away, there was a small cluster of businesses, including a Blockbuster Video that we could easily walk to. I volunteered to go and pick up the movie, feeling pretty grown up about it. My parents said sure, as long as I went nowhere else. They handed me enough cash for the rental. It took around 20 minutes on foot, passing through our neighborhood, crossing a busier street, then through a park, and I'd arrive. By late afternoon, I made it to Blockbuster. It was fairly busy as usual. I wandered the aisles looking for our chosen film, which I can't recall now, and eventually found it. I also picked up some candy because they sold that up front. After checking out, I started my return trip using the same route. While crossing into the park, I caught sight of a man walking behind me, more from the corner of my eye than anything else. I kept moving, and so did he. When I got near our street, I glanced back and realized he was still behind me, a good 50 feet back. I didn't recognize him and could only note that he was heavier set and wearing a cap. I was just a couple of minutes away from my house, so I really hoped he wouldn't speed up. But then he did, gradually. By the time I reached our driveway, the guy was only about 20 feet away. I turned in, and he kept walking past the house, though I noticed he slowed his pace to watch me. I rushed inside, relieved to be safe at home. About 20 minutes later, my mom asked me to water the flowers in the front yard. She was busy cooking dinner with my dad, so I headed back outside. That's when I saw the man again. He was on the road, right by our yard. As soon as he spotted me, I tried to stay calm and just water the flowers. I started from the side of the yard farthest from him, working my way over, but he never moved on. Once I got close to him, I heard footsteps. He wasn't leaving. In fact, he was entering our yard. I turned to see him a few feet in, and I took off around to the other side and straight into our home, locking the door behind me. A glance out the window showed he'd vanished. I was hoping that was the end of it, but maybe 10 minutes later, I peeked outside again and spotted him. This time, he was only about 10 feet away from our window, moving even closer. The moment he saw me watching, I bolted to the kitchen, telling my parents that someone had followed me home and was now in our yard. We all went to the living room, and the man was still out there. That set my dad off. He ran outside yelling. We watched as Dad sprinted into the street, and the man quickly fled. We were sure he wouldn't come back, and thankfully he didn't. I still find it unnerving how brazen he was. I initially thought I was just overreacting when I saw him on my walk home, but clearly I wasn't. Story 4. Picture this scenario. I'm subbing for a class of 4 students who couldn't join a field trip due to missing permission slips. The regular teacher and the rest of the students were off on the field trip, leaving me with these 4. After I finished subbing for another class, I was asked to take over. My instructions were simple. Show them a Mythbusters video and hand out some worksheets. Sounds simple enough, right? Turns out things took a wild detour. Just a few minutes after we started the Fab Four, these 4 students who seemed glued at the hip raised their hands, asking to use the bathroom. I'm usually pretty relaxed, so I said okay. Just come right back so we can finish the episode. They agreed and left. I paused the video, waiting. A short while passed, then out of nowhere, the intercom announced a lockdown. This was not a drill. Immediately I panicked, realizing my 4 students weren't in the room. I debated whether to hunt them down or stick to the lockdown protocol, lock the doors and turn off the lights. I hovered by the door for about a minute, hoping the students would return. Then I made the decision to go track them down, figuring they were likely in the nearest restroom. I hurried to the hallway, worried for their safety. I got a little out of breath. I'm definitely not as fit as I used to be, and headed into the restroom, knocking on the door, calling for them. "Guys, we're on lockdown. Come back to the classroom," I shouted, my words echoing. No reply at all. I eased the door open further, thinking maybe they'd jump out. Nothing, completely empty. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I couldn't linger any longer, though, since the main rule in a lockdown is to stay put and secure the space. If they had wandered off, hopefully someone else would find them. Somewhat frazzled, I hustled back to my assigned classroom. 10 minutes crept by, felt more like an hour, and still no sign of the missing 4. Then I heard this odd noise from inside the room. A quick glance around revealed nothing. Tense and unsure, I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but it happened once more. This time I spotted a figure crouching behind a desk near the back. Anxiously I asked, "Who's there?" hoping it was just a mischievous student. But the shape that emerged wasn't one of my kids. It was a grown man, a total stranger. I panicked and sprinted out, frantically searching for help. You might wonder why I ran instead of standing my ground. Well, I'm a bit older now and far from a martial artist, so the odds of me restraining a random intruder weren't great. I pounded on the door of the closest classroom, and the teacher there quickly let me in. Their expression turned to alarm as I explained about the unknown man in my room. They called the principal, who notified the police. The school erupted in commotion as officers swarmed the halls. Apparently, the person I stumbled upon was the exact reason for the lockdown. He must have snuck in while I'd left the classroom to find my students. That chilling reality made my mind reel with what-ifs. As for the 4 kids, they ended up sheltering in another room without anyone informing me. Whispers circulated about the intruder's motives. Maybe he was armed or searching for someone specific. The truth stayed mostly under wraps, but we were fortunate that no one was harmed. That day taught me a whole new set of lessons, and I took a good chunk of time off to recover. Story 5. A few years back, I moved into a different apartment. I'm a woman and the place was somewhat old, on the outskirts of the city. It was the only option I could afford then. It was a tiny one-bedroom on the 5th floor of a tall building. Although minimal, it had a decent location and enough space for me. My hallway alone had something like 15 or 20 other apartments. I made 3 or 4 trips hauling boxes from my car to my unit. On my final trip, I happened to see a man leaving his unit a bit down the hall. The first neighbor I encountered. After finishing the moving process, I spent the rest of the day unpacking, and by night, I was done. I was off work for the next few days, so I decided to treat myself to takeout, staying up late to enjoy my new place. Around midnight, I heard someone knock. Strange time for a visit, but I got up and checked the peephole. It was the neighbor I'd spotted earlier. Yes, it was odd he was knocking this late, but I opened the door. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 5 inches tall, with glasses and shoulder-length hair. He greeted me, shook my hand, and introduced himself as Andrew, saying he lived a few doors down. He was a bit awkward, but I tried to see it as a friendly gesture that he wanted to say hello. After our quick introductions, we stood there awkwardly until he asked me if I'd like to come over for coffee. I politely declined, pointing out it was getting late and I needed to sleep. He asked if I was sure. I repeated that I was, so he said okay, and I shut the door. I'd told him I was going to bed, but honestly, it just seemed weird that he'd pop by so late. The next day I went grocery shopping and then hung around my apartment. But that night, sure enough, there was another knock at my door. It was Andrew again. I answered, and he claimed that some of my mail had been accidentally delivered to him, specifically a package. I was confused, wondering if that even happened, but I was curious, so I agreed to get it. I followed him to his apartment, which wasn't far from mine. At the door, he waved me in, so I stepped inside. It looked messy, a similar layout to mine, but a bit dirtier. Andrew claimed he kept my package in his bedroom for safekeeping. We went there, and that room was nearly empty. Almost immediately after we entered, Andrew maneuvered behind me and let the bedroom door slam shut. I bolted for it, but I heard a lock click. It was sealed, and my heart sank at how foolish I'd been considering his odd behavior. His story about my package sounded off the moment I thought about it. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Andrew had vanished from near the door, and I couldn't see him. I called out, demanding he let me go, but no response. I noticed a window covered by some panel or something. When I moved it aside, I saw it was painted black from the inside, and it wouldn't budge open. Desperate, I tried shouting, but nothing. After pacing around, I resorted to pounding on the wall that faced the next apartment, hoping someone would hear. When that failed, I struck the wall harder, banging with my elbow until bits of it broke. Finally, the locked door swung open, and Andrew reappeared, yelling at me to stop. He advanced quickly, so I grabbed the small nightstand, the only nearby object, and thrust it forward as he came closer. He stumbled back enough for me to dart around him and out of the bedroom. I sprinted for the main door, which I managed to open before he could catch me. Andrew lunged, trying to keep me inside, but just then, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I started screaming, and as the footsteps neared, Andrew shoved me aside and bolted out of his unit and down the corridor. The person in the hallway was a neighbor who'd heard the commotion. I hurried to my own place and locked up. We called the police, but Andrew was gone by the time they arrived. Fortunately, they found him later. I'm grateful I got away, and especially relieved that neighbor came to investigate. Who knows what would have happened otherwise. Story 6. When I was a sophomore in high school, my family relocated 2 hours away to a new city in the same state for my mom's job. While I liked that we were closer to shops and things to do, I disliked not knowing anyone, and I had to attend a new high school. My old school had only about 50 students in each grade, but the new one had nearly 200, so it felt much bigger. In those first weeks, while the people were mostly friendly, I hadn't made any real friends. Then I met a kid I'll call Joe, also new in my gym class. We paired up for a game and got along decently. We also discovered we shared the same fifth-hour class and soon became fast friends, doing homework together when teachers gave us time and eating lunch at the same table. A few more weeks passed and I made other acquaintances, but Joe was still my closest friend. He had somewhat long brown hair, wore glasses, and was average in height. Generally easygoing, though sometimes he'd say something a bit odd. We didn't have many shared interests besides both being new and sharing 2 classes. Our conversations typically revolved around basic stuff. At one point, Joe suggested we hang out at my place after school. I said sure and gave him my address for Friday. This was roughly a month into the term, but on that Friday, when I checked in with him, he said he couldn't make it. He had apparently forgotten about another obligation, so he suggested maybe next week. I wasn't too let down. I usually just gamed on Friday nights anyway. That evening I got home, grabbed a quick meal, and hopped on the computer or console. I barely had any homework, so it was easy to spend time gaming. I stayed up late, around 1 in the morning, before heading to bed. Our house was single-story, with my room facing the street, my brother's bedroom next door, and my parents' room across the hall near the bathroom. I must have been in a deep sleep because I woke to a sound in my room, feeling groggy at first. Then another noise got my attention. Glancing around in the dim light from my TV, I realized the window curtains had shifted, and the window was raised. I looked down by the window and spotted a silhouette. I jumped upright in bed, only to see the figure stand, and it was Joe. At first, I was so stunned I stayed silent. He looked back at me, giving a soft, weird chuckle. Finally, I managed to whisper, "What are you doing here?" He didn't reply immediately and then just muttered, "Nothing." I was still half asleep and unsure how to respond. Suddenly, Joe stepped back toward the window, climbed outside, and slid it shut behind him. I watched him walking away down the street. My guess is he'd taken advantage of the fact that my window was usually opened just an inch at night, but I have no clue why. When I checked the time, it was nearly 4 in the morning. I was unsettled but eventually dozed off. On Monday, I meant to confront Joe, but he didn't show up to school that day, or for the rest of the semester. I only glimpsed him once or twice the following term in the hallway, and we never actually spoke. After that year ended, I think he must have transferred out again because I never saw him. In recent times, I've tried looking for him online, but with his common name, I've come up empty. I suspect he came to take something from me and got startled when I woke up. Story 7. This incident happened when I was 19, living at home and working part-time at the local Dollar Tree. I usually had shifts 2 to 4 nights a week, generally in the evening, often closing. Our store wasn't too busy, and by closing time, we'd usually have just 1 or 2 staff. One night, after a fairly normal shift, I arrived home around 10:30, having left a bit before the 10 p.m. closing. My coworker had locked up the store. My parents said goodnight and headed to bed. I stayed up for a bit, ate some pizza, and watched TV before planning to crash. Our living room was near the front of the house, with a big window facing the yard and driveway, so you can see if anyone pulls in. While I sat on the couch, I noticed headlights out the window, a car entering our driveway. That was strange, and I wasn't sure who it could be. My younger brother was 16 then, but already home, so it wasn't him. The car paused near the back of the drive, then turned off its headlights. Weird. For a couple of minutes, nobody got out. The engine stayed running. Eventually, the car reversed out and drove away. I assumed it was someone who took a wrong turn or decided to turn around quietly. I shrugged it off and went back to my show. I ended up staying up another hour. Just before midnight, I saw lights again. Seemed like the same car returning. This time it parked and the engine cut off. My heart rate increased when I heard a door open. I tried to remain unseen, ensuring our front door was locked. Soon, footsteps reached the door, and I heard someone try the knob. I carefully peeked outside and saw a large man with shoulder-length curly dark hair. No clue who he was. Nervous, I dashed to my parents' room and woke my dad, telling him some stranger was at our door. I noticed the man never actually knocked. He just tried opening it. By the time Dad got to the living room, the man and car were gone. Dad did a quick check, found nothing. The rest of the night was thankfully uneventful. Next day, I had another Dollar Tree shift, 4 to 10, typical. At first, it was hectic with customers, but it slowed down later. By about 9, I was the only one there because my coworker left. Around 9:30, a man walked in. The moment I saw him, my stomach flipped. He was big, had that same long, curly dark hair. It looked just like the man from the night before. Glancing out at the lot, I recognized a small car like the one in our driveway. I tried to stay calm. He might not realize I lived there. The man wandered around out of sight for maybe 5 minutes, then emerged near the front without buying anything and walked out. I felt a wave of relief. However, from the window, I saw him sit in his car without leaving. I kept watching, hoping he'd drive away, but he didn't. With no more customers, I decided to lock up early and go home. I sped through the store closing checklist, then headed to the exit. Seeing his car still there made me anxious. I had parked out back, but his car was closer to the store, so we were alone in that part of the lot. I stepped outside and took only a few steps before his door swung open. Immediately, I turned and walked quickly down the sidewalk past other closed shops, hearing him behind me. I didn't look back, but he was definitely following. My heart pounded. Eventually, I saw a Target up ahead that was still open with cars in its lot. I beelined for it. The man trailed me at a distance the entire time. Once inside Target, I found myself weaving through different aisles, texting my mom. She said she'd pick me up in about 10 minutes. I stayed on the move. Each time I switched aisles, I'd catch sight of him again, still trailing behind. Finally, my mom arrived, waiting outside. When I reached the doors, I saw her car. I bolted straight for it and got in. Then we noticed him stepping out of Target as she drove off. His own vehicle was way back in the other lot, so he couldn't stop us. Once we got home, my dad took her to retrieve my car, and the man was gone by then. He never reappeared. I figured he'd seen me working that initial night and followed me home. It was terrifying. Story 8. This happened when I was in college, living with my parents over the summer. I mostly had the entire basement to myself. There was a large TV down there, plus my bedroom and a bathroom. My folks rarely ventured downstairs. When finals finished, I packed my dorm stuff and drove home, finding the house empty as they were out. They said they'd return in a few hours, leaving me alone. I unlocked the door, brought in my things, and started to unpack in the basement. At one point, while watching TV in the main area, I thought I heard something from my bedroom, which had its door shut. Not alarmed at first, I went to check. The moment I opened my bedroom door, I heard the closet door quickly close. I glanced over, and it was definitely shut tight. Now I was feeling slightly uneasy. Only a person could have closed it like that. I decided not to investigate the closet. Instead, I left the room, feeling uncomfortable about being down there. I went back upstairs and hung out in the living room for around 30 minutes with no disturbances. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the stairs. I knew it wasn't my parents because they hadn't come home yet. I stared at the stairway, waiting to see who appeared. Soon enough, a man came into view, a stranger about my age or slightly older, with a beard and longer hair. He looked like he could be on drugs. I stood up and demanded, "Who are you?" He didn't speak, he just kept coming closer. I warned him to leave or I'd call the police. Still no response. He kept advancing, pushing me back until I was almost cornered. I bolted to the side, ending up in a back part of the house. He charged, grabbing at my leg, causing me to fall. Fortunately, he fell too, and I scrambled to my feet first, darting to the staircase and rushing down to exit the front door. He followed a short distance behind, chasing me into the street. By the time I'd reached a spot a few houses away, I turned and saw he'd stopped. It looked like someone nearby noticed us. A neighbor in his late 50s was outside, so I ran straight to him, explaining the situation. In the distance, the intruder headed back toward our home. My neighbor led me inside his house, and we called the police, who arrived about 10 minutes later. The man was gone by then. The officers searched the neighborhood but couldn't locate him. I stayed at the neighbor's place until my parents returned, which took a couple more hours. They were in total shock when they heard what happened. For a long time after, I felt scared to be alone in the house. It took me ages to fully calm down, but I'm thankful my neighbor was there. Who knows how it would have turned out otherwise.